This is Audible.
The Edomites, the history and legacy of the Kingdom of Edom in the ancient Near East. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Delane Daniels. These are the kings who ruled in the land of Edom before a king ruled the children of Israel. And Bela ben Beor ruled in Edom, and the name of his city was Dinhabah. And Bela died, and Jobab ben Zerah from Bozrah ruled in his place. And Jobab died, and Husham of the land of Temani ruled in his place. And Husham died, and Hadad ben Bedad, who struck Midian in the field of Moab, ruled in his place, and the name of his city was Avith. And Hadad died, and Samlah of Masrekah ruled in his place. And Samlah died, and Saul of Rehoboth on the river ruled in his place. And Saul died, and Baal-hanan ben Achbor ruled in his place. And Baal-hanan ben Achbor died, and Hadar ruled in his place. The name of his city was Pau. And his wife's name was Mehetabel bat Matred bat Mezahab. And these are the names of the clans of Esau by their families, by their place, by their names: Clan Timnah, Clan Alvah, Clan Jetheth, Clan Aholibamah, Clan Elah, Clan Pinon, Clan Kenaz, Clan Timon, Clan Mibzar, Clan Magdiel, Clan Iram. Genesis 36. The ancient Edomites were just one of the many cultures inhabiting the Levant during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age. But they remain known thousands of years later thanks to mentions in the Old Testament. The Bible indicates that the Edomites and their kingdom had a complex relationship, first with the Hebrews and then with the Israelites. According to the Bible, the Edomites were descended from a different branch of the Israelites' family tree, and as such, were treated as brothers at times, but at other times they were sworn enemies. Given those facts, understanding the true nature of the Edomites and their culture has been somewhat problematic for historians due to the lack of source material. Most of the references to the Edomites come from the Bible, which, historically accurate about many points, is clearly biased against the enemies of Israel. Thus, scholars have also turned to texts from the Egyptians and Assyrians and excavations from the Levant to form a more comprehensive image of a culture that in many ways was very similar to that of the Israelites. Such assessments reveal that the Edomites' origins can be traced back to the wider Canaanite culture that was dominant in the Levant in the Late Bronze Age. During that time, the Edomites came into contact with the Egyptians and also re-encountered the Hebrews. After coming back into contact with the Hebrews, the Edomites seemingly faded from the historical record until the creation of the Kingdom of Israel in the early first millennium BCEE. The Edomites then played a subservient and clearly inferior role to the Israelites, at least politically, until the time was right and they could make a major play for their longtime rivals' land. Ultimately, the Edomites flourished for several centuries, only to suffer the same fate as the Israelites. They were swept up in the storm of wars and migrations that characterized the Near East from the end of the Bronze Age until the dominance of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. The Edomites, the history and legacy of the Kingdom of Edom in the ancient Near East, examines how the culture flourished in parts of modern Jordan and Israel before the Babylonian conquest. Along with pictures depicting important people, places, and events, you will learn about Edom like never before. Ancient sources. In order to understand the Edomites in their proper historical context, it is important to understand the available sources and their veracity, or lack thereof, in describing certain events and other details. The sources are somewhat of a double-edged sword when it comes to the Edomites. because there are plenty of written sources that reference the Edomites, but some are clearly biased and others are incomplete. The passages in the Bible in particular are biased and were written from the perspective of the Hebrews or Israelites, so the Edomites are often portrayed negatively or ignored in discussions of important political events. The Egyptian texts, on the other hand, depicted the Edomites as weak people, constantly under the thumb of the Egyptians and usually worth mentioning only in passing. Similarly, the Assyrians depicted the Edomites as just another cog in the wheel of their vast empire, although the names of Edomite kings were mentioned. Of course, these historiographical problems are not necessarily unique to the Edomites in the ancient Near East. Historical accounts written before the works of the ancient Greeks were usually written in a political and/or religious context, so they were not written for the purposes of edification and information. As a result, ancient Near Eastern histories were not always written in a standard narrative form, making it difficult for historians to determine events in chronological order. After all, the historical texts of the Egyptians, Assyrians, and even the Hebrews to a certain extent were written for their gods, not for posterity or teaching readers, so events were sometimes written about in the order that the chronicler believed would be most important to the deity or deities in question. Nevertheless, these texts remain the only sources available for information about the Edomites' history. The Old Testament is the largest source of primary texts about the land of Edom and the Edomites. Just as the Bible follows the complete history of the Israelites, it does the same with the Edomites from their origins and early conflicts in the Bronze Age until they appropriated much of Judah's territory in the 6th century BCE. Therefore, the Bible is certainly a good place to start in a study of the Edomites, but there are also problems that must be realized when using it as a source. The books of the Old Testament that cover events before the Kingdom of Israel was established, shortly before 1000 BCE, such as Numbers and Deuteronomy, are not chronologically specific and cover a vast amount of time, circa 2000 to 1400 BCE. Kurt, 2010, 423. It is also important to remember that the Old Testament is historically biased in favor of the Hebrews or Israelites and is a mixture of religious laws, theology, and history, so it is important to view the Old Testament as an ancient historical source that tells how the Israelites viewed their own history and the people around them, including the Edomites. Kurt, 2010, 424. Egyptian sources from the New Kingdom make short but numerous references to the Edomites as one of the many Canaanite people that ruled in the Levant. The names for the people would occasionally change, so it is sometimes difficult to identify them in the texts, but based on what is now known of the Egyptian Empire in the New Kingdom, the Edomites were certainly under the yoke of Egyptian rule during the late Bronze Age, which would have included when the Hebrews traveled around Edom during the Exodus. The Edomites are identified in the Egyptian texts from the primary mountain in their homeland, which is also mentioned in numerous biblical passages. An important Egyptian text, which will be discussed more thoroughly later, also mentions Edom specifically along with Judah in the same relative vicinity. The most important non-biblical sources for Edomite history is the first millennium BCE were the Assyrian annals. Although the Assyrians built their reputation on their conquests and often brutal martial tactics, they also developed an extensive historiographical corpus. Notably, the Assyrian kings recorded detailed reports of all their military campaigns, which gave insights into Edom's role in the Assyrian Empire, and also the Edomites' relationship with the Israelites. The texts reveal that the Edomites followed their own political agenda and were quite adept at knowing who to align with at the proper times. Thus, when the Egyptians and Assyrian sources are considered along with the Old Testament references to the Edomites, and when modern archaeological discoveries are properly understood, a more accurate picture of the land of Edom and the Edomites can be painted. The location of Edom. The precise location of Edom, at least in terms of its definite boundary lines, is nearly impossible to determine due to the nature of Edomite society. The Edomites left none of their own recorded texts, and they were a semi-nomadic, pastoral people for most of their history. But based on the sources discussed above, an approximate location and size of the region can be determined. Edom's northern boundary was on the southern shore of the Dead Sea and went south to the Gulf of Aqaba. The region consisted mostly of hills and mountains and would have unofficially ended on the western and eastern sides in the deserts. Hall and Jotiski, 2009, 53. According to the Old Testament and the Egyptian texts, Edom was associated with Mount Seir, and Esau took his wives and his sons and his daughters, and all the persons of his house, and his cattle and all his beasts, and all his substance, which he had got in the land of Canaan, and went into the country from the face of his brother Jacob. For their riches were more than they might dwell together, and the land wherein they were strangers could not bear them because of their cattle. Thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. Genesis 36, 6-8. Modern archaeological studies have indicated that Edom itself was unofficially divided into two sections. The northern part, where Mount Seir is located, was the most populous area, while the south was more of a wilderness. Kitchen, 2003, 194. When the Edomites settled into their home near Mount Seir sometime in the Bronze Age, they were not alone. In fact, the Bronze Age Levant was a very active place around 2000 BCE. Several advanced Canaanite city-states had already formed, primarily near the coast, and the larger and more powerful kingdoms in Mesopotamia and Egypt had by then developed connections to the region. Conflicts occurred regularly as the various Canaanite groups challenged each other for farmland and pasture grounds, as well as trade routes. The Edomites were no different in this respect, at least according to the Bible, which asserted that they acquired their homeland through force. The book of Deuteronomy noted that they conquered their land from an obscure people known as the Horims. The Horims also dwelt in Seir before time, but the children of Esau succeeded them. When they had destroyed them from before them, and dwelt in their stead, as Israel did unto the land of his possessions, which the Lord gave unto them. Deuteronomy 2:12. Although it is difficult to say for sure when the Edomites pushed the Horims out of the Mount Seir region, it probably took place in the late 14th or early 13th century BCE. Glock, 1957, 77. The Edomites' origin. The Edomites were, in many ways, related to the other Canaanites in the Levant, but they shared a special relationship with the Hebrews or Israelites, and it's impossible to fully understand their history without understanding the nature of that relationship. The difference between the Hebrews and the Israelites is important to point out here as well, since the Hebrews were essentially the Bronze Age Semitic group that wandered around the Levant until settling down and establishing a kingdom around 1020 BCE, subsequently becoming the Israelites. The Edomites thus had extensive contacts with the Hebrews before they migrated to Egypt, and the Edomites then had more contacts with the Hebrews after Exodus, continuing up through the establishment of Israel. The Edomites and Israelites not only had linguistic and cultural affinities, but they were also linked through geography, tradition, and religion to some extent. In the Old Testament, The relationship between the Edomites and Israelites began when the progenitors of the two tribes were still in the womb. According to the book of Genesis, Jacob and Esau were twins who began their battle before they were born. Isaac and his wife Rebekah were told that they would give birth to two great nations, and that one would be more powerful than the other. The passage is read, "And the Lord said unto her, Two nations are in thy womb, and two manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. The other people, and the elder, shall serve the younger. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb, and the first came out all red, all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau." Genesis 25, 23, and 24. The two were raised and lived together as young adults, with Esau being promised the birthright of Israel. But chance and a bit of treachery changed everything. Esau was originally supposed to have the birthright of Israel, but he sold it to Jacob when he was in a desperate situation. Genesis continued, "And Isaac loved Esau, because he did eat of his venison, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And Jacob sawed pottage, and Esau came from the field, and he was faint, and Esau said to Jacob, Feed me, I pray thee, with the same red pottage, for I am faint." Therefore his name was called Edom. And Jacob said, "Sell me this day thy birthright." And Esau said, "Behold, I am at the point to die, and what profit shall this birthright do me?" And Jacob said, "Swear to me this day." And he sware unto him, and he sold his birthright unto Jacob. Then Jacob gave Esau bread and pottage of lentils, and he went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. Genesis 25, 28 through 34. Knowing that he had cheated Esau of the inheritance, Jacob fled the region for several years, but he later returned and made amends of sorts with Esau. God commanded the two brothers to reconcile. And Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother unto the land of Seir and the country of Edom. And he commanded them, saying, Thus shall ye speak unto my lord Esau. Thy servant Jacob saith thus, I have sojourned with Laban, and stayed there until now, and I have oxen, and asses, flocks, and men servants, and women servants. And I have sent to tell my lord, that I may find grace in thy sight. Genesis 32, 3 through 5. Esau agreed to the peace, but the two brothers went their separate ways, never to deal with each other again. Esau and his descendants claimed and inhabited what would become Edom, while Jacob's family's journey became the basis for the rest of the Old Testament. It would be Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, who faced many trials and tribulations in Egypt along with his people. Joseph's people lived in the Egyptian delta and grew in numbers for several centuries, developing a distinct religion and culture in the process. But sometime during the Egyptian New Kingdom, probably in the middle of the 13th century BCE, the Hebrews left Egypt. Of course, this journey was most famously described by Exodus. Hull and Jotishki, 2009, 38. Most of the proposed routes of the Exodus are quite circuitous, but all roads led to Edom near the end of the journey. When the Hebrews entered the Levant, they did so as invaders and were treated as such by all the Canaanites they encountered. The Old Testament included vivid tales of massacres committed by the Hebrews against various Canaanites and vice versa, and the fact that the Hebrews had their women and children with them should not confuse the fact that they were also a well-armed force. Although Moses tried to persuade the Edomites to cooperate on the basis of their shared heritage, the descendants of Esau were not too happy to see the Hebrews at their doorstep. The interactions between the Edomites and the Hebrews during the Exodus are primarily discussed in Numbers and Deuteronomy, and at first glance, The account seems a bit confusing and possibly contradictory, but this is because they describe two different encounters. The Bible is quite clear that Moses and the Hebrews spent several years wandering in the Sinai and then the Levant, but the chronology is confusing. According to Numbers, the Hebrews approached Edom from the west and asked for safe passage through the land. "Let us pass, I pray thee, through thy country. We will not pass through the fields or through the vineyards, neither will we drink of the water of the wells. We will go by the king's highway. We will not turn to the right nor to the left, until we have passed thy borders." And Edom said unto him, "Thou shalt not pass by me, lest I come out against thee with the sword." And the children of Israel said unto him, "We will go by the highway, and if I and my cattle drink of thy water, then I will pay for it. I will only, without doing anything else, go through on my feet." And he said, "Thou shalt not go through." And Edom came out against him with much people and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through his border, wherefore Israel turned away from him. Numbers 20:17-20. The Edomites logically viewed the several thousand Hebrews as an invading force and believed that allowing them to pass would have challenged their sovereignty and possibly the stability of their kingdom. Kitchen concluded that the Edomite king was unhappy with the Hebrews because of the direction from which they approached Edom. According to Numbers, the Hebrews attempted to enter Edom from the west, which may have included disputed territory that the Edomites claimed. Kitchen, 2003, 195. Conversely, the account in Deuteronomy provided a more positive image of the Edomites, claiming that they were viewed as brothers and allowed God's weary children to sojourn in their land for some time. "Then we turned and took our journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea, as the Lord spake unto me, and we compassed Mount Seir many days. And the Lord spake unto me, saying, Ye have compassed this mountain long enough. Turn you northward, and command thou people, saying, Ye are to pass through the coast of your brethren, the children of Esau, which dwell in Mount Seir, and they shall be afraid of you. Take ye good heed unto yourself, therefore, meddle not with them, for I will not give you of their land, no, not so much as a foot breadth, because I have given Mount Seir unto Esau for a possession. Ye shall buy meat of them for money, that ye may eat. And ye shall also buy water of them for money, that ye may drink. For the Lord thy God has blessed thee in all the works of thy hand. He knoweth thy walking through this great wilderness, these 40 years the Lord thy God hath been with thee. Thou hast lacked nothing. And when we pass by from our brethren the children of Esau, which dwelt in Seir, through the way of the plain from Elath and from Ezongeber, we turned and passed by the way of the wilderness of Moab. Deuteronomy 2, 1-8. While these two accounts seem contradictory, they are easily reconciled due to the circuitous route of the Hebrews, the lack of proper chronology in the early books of the Old Testament, and the relatively large size of Edom. It appears that the Hebrew first approached Edom from the west, and were then denied by the Edomite king who controlled the king's highway. The king of northern Edom was obviously well equipped if he could repel a force as large as the Hebrews, especially one that had already demonstrated their military strength in the region. This would indicate northern Edom was either protected by a large army or guarded by several forts, or both. After that, the Hebrews may have moved south along the western edge of Edom to the Gulf of Aqaba, and then went through the wilderness section of Edom before turning north. Glatt, Gilead, 1997, 443-445. It is also very likely that the Edomites of the southern portion of Edom were different than the group who originally denied the Hebrew passage. Glatt, Gilead, 1997, 445. the group in the south was apparently less armed and organized than the northern Edomites, and were quite possibly still in a nomadic stage of development. Edomite government and culture. As the questions surrounding the interaction between the Hebrews and Edomites immediately after the Exodus suggest, modern scholars know very little about the composition of the Edomite government. In fact, the evidence that a true Edomite state even existed is quite thin beyond the Bible. The book of Genesis lists 8 kings of Edom, but it is difficult to know for sure when these kings actually ruled. The passage lists the kings by name as follows: "And these are the kings that reigned in the land of Edom before there reigned any king over the children of Israel. And Bela the son of Beor reigned in Edom, and the name of his city was Dinhabah. And Bela died, and Jobab the son of Zerah of Bozrah reigned in his stead. And Jobab died, and Husham of the land of Temani reigned in his stead. And Husham died, and Hadad the son of Bedad, who smote Midian in the field of Moab, reigned in his stead, and the name of his city was Avith. And Hadad died, and Samlah of Masrekah reigned in his stead. And Samlah died, and Saul of Rehoboth by the river reigned in his stead. And Saul died, and Baal-hanan the son of Achbor reigned in his stead. And Baal-hanan the son of Achbor died, and Hadar reigned in his stead, and the name of his city was Pau. And his wife's name was Mehetabel, the daughter of Matred, the daughter of Mezahab." Genesis 36:31-39. The passage suggests that not only did the Edomites have at least one dynastic house in their history, but they also had a city. One of the scholarly arguments against an Edomite kingdom is that kingdoms only come after a group becomes sedentary, but Kitchen argued that this is not necessarily so. He claimed instead that the Edomites were a semi-pastoral society at the time of the biblical Exodus, and that they did in fact have an established monarchy at the time. Kitchen, 2003, 196-197. It should also be pointed out that there is never a clear point when a society transitions from one phase of development to the next. After all, semi-pastoral societies can have permanent structures where they spend part of the year, or at least specific places where they go seasonally. The above passage also indicates that the Edomite kings reigned before there was any king over Israel, which would place the chronology for a Proto-Edomite state at least 100 years before 1020 BCE. Kitchen, 2003, 354. The presence of a semi-developed state under the rulership of a dynasty would help to explain how and why the Hebrews were rebuffed when they attempted to enter northern Edom from the west, but were allowed to pass through the less organized southern Edom. Besides the lack of textual evidence outside of the Bible for an Edomite dynasty, historians often cite the lack of urban settlements and monuments in Edom as another argument that Edom was not a true state. Nelson Glueck, though, conducted numerous excavations there in the mid-20th century and came to a different conclusion. He insisted the Edomites developed a sophisticated society, not unlike other Canaanites in the Levant, that had a high point from the 13th century BCE all the way up until the 8th century BCE. Glueck, 1947. Glueck thinks that the Edomites transitioned to a sedentary society when the Hebrews passed through their land in the late Bronze Age, which would account for the northern Edomites being seemingly more organized and advanced than the southern Edomites. Based on his archaeological excavations of the region, Glueck believed that Edom was more organized than most other scholars thought, and still think. and that the Edomites at least had some armed fortresses and escorts for trade caravans, if not actual cities. Glueck, 1947, 78. At the same time, he argued that Edom did have urban settlements and probably a royal palace, and he cited Amos 1:12 as proof. But I will send a fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Bozrah. Teman was another name for Edom, and Bozrah in the passage was apparently an urban location in Edom. Bozrah is also mentioned in the biblical king list of the Edomite kings, Genesis 36:33, as the home of King Zerah, and Bozrah is also referenced in the prophecies of Jeremiah and Isaiah. The references in Isaiah is particularly interesting. And all the host of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll, and all their host shall fall down, as the leaf falleth off from the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon the Idumea, and upon the people of my curse, to judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of rams. For the Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea. Isaiah 34:4-6. Although this passage is a prophecy, and therefore not necessarily meant to be historically accurate, it does illustrate that Bozrah was viewed as an important city by the Israelites because it was mentioned separately from Idumea, the Greek word for Edom. As ancient Bozrah has been discovered and excavated, but it was only a primary settlement from the 7th century BCE onward, which means the biblical passages that mention the city are either anachronistic or referred to a semi-permanent site that later became Bozrah. Since Glueck's excavations and subsequent excavations by other archaeologists have not uncovered much more than forts and small settlements during the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, the extent of the Edomite state during those periods remains a source of debate. While the Edomites did not leave behind many written texts, they did develop writing later in their history, and the inscriptions show that it was a variation of a Canaanite language, which greatly assists researchers in learning more about their culture. Hackett, 2001, 153. The fact that the Edomites spoke a Canaanite language and were therefore technically Canaanite is not surprising when one considers that most of the people in the Bronze Age Levant were also Canaanite, and that the Hebrews and Israelites also spoke a language closely related to Canaanite. The Edomites' affinity with the Canaanites can also possibly help explain their form of government, or lack thereof, since the Canaanites never had a centralized government or empire across the Levant. In fact, that's a major reason they were vulnerable when confronting the Egyptian and Hittite empires in the Late Bronze Age. The Canaanites used a city-state model, and it is possible that even within Edom, the land was divided into smaller states that were sometimes antagonistic towards each other, which would explain why the Hebrews were denied access to travel through Edom at one point, but then allowed to do so at another. The nature of Edomite religion is also somewhat enigmatic. Most of the Canaanites of the Late Bronze Age followed a polytheistic religion similar to what the Phoenicians later practiced. The Canaanites' deities included El, Dagon, Baal, Hadad, and Anath, who were all also known to the Israelites. Hillers, 1985, 257. The fact that one of the Edomite kings listed in the Edomite king list in Genesis is named Baal-Hadad certainly suggests that the Edomites worshipped a pantheon similar to their Canaanite cousins before the existence of Israel. More recently, evidence has been uncovered that the Edomites' primary god was named Quas, but little is known about him. Hackett, 2001, 156. Modern scholars believe that the Israelites' God was almost certainly known in Edom, especially after King David conquered the region, and that Yahweh may have had similar attributes to the primary Edomite god. Yahweh may have even been worshipped in Edom along with Quas, but solid proof remains elusive. Azizi, 2006, 18. The Edomites and the Egyptians. The majority of the Bronze Age primary source documentation for the Edomites, aside from the Bible, comes from ancient Egyptians who kept historical annals. The texts are important because they can be placed in a specific chronological order, and the geography is also fairly defined, at least compared to other Bronze Age texts. Most of these texts were written in the Egyptian hieroglyphic script on the walls of some of the greatest temples from the New Kingdom, circa 1550 to 1075 BCE. And there are also some references to the Edomites on some papyrus rolls. A few of them even date back to the Middle Kingdom, circa 2000 to 1700 BCE. The Edomites are usually referred to as Shasu in the Egyptian texts, and often as part of the Egyptian Empire. Egyptologists believe that the earliest Egyptian mention of Edom or the Edomites can be found in the Middle Kingdom execration texts. The execration texts were simply the names of non-Egyptian peoples, deemed to be hostile, written on small statues of prisoners or pottery and then buried in a magic ritual. Shaw and Nicholson, 1995-94. The Edomites are mentioned in some of these texts, and there is also a Levantine character in the Egyptian fictional story, The Tale of Sinui, with a name very similar to the Edomite Jeush in Genesis 36:18. Kitchen, 2003, 473. The few Egyptian mentions of the Edomites during the Middle Kingdom is proof that the Egyptians did not have as much influence in the Levant at that time. Once that changed during the New Kingdom, however, the Shasu are mentioned frequently. These historical texts coincided with the late Bronze Age system, which Egypt played a major role in. The Levant basically became a buffer zone between the Hittite and Egyptian empires, with the various Canaanite states pitting the bigger powers against each other for their own advantage. The Egyptians referred to the Levant in general as Ritinu, and the different tribes either by ethnic designation or by their city if they were sedentary. The Edomites, for the most part, are described in the text as semi-pastoral. One of the first New Kingdom mentions of the Shasu, Edomites, came in the 39th year of the rule of the 18th dynasty king Thutmose III, ruled circa 1479 to 1425 BCE. It states, Year 39, Behold, his majesty was in the land of Ritinu, on the 14th victorious expedition, after his going to defeat the fallen ones of Shasu. Brest, 2001, 211. The numerous military expeditions that Thutmose III led into the Levant effectively pacified the southern portion of the region, putting it under Egyptian control, but later Egyptian kings would have to campaign in the Levant, Ritinu, periodically, in order to keep the Hittites at bay and to rein in any recalcitrant Canaanite tribes and city-states. After the near collapse of the Egyptian state in the late 18th dynasty, the Shasu were mentioned again in numerous 19th dynasty texts. According to reliefs and texts on the Karnak temple, the Edomites challenged the authority of Seti I, reigned circa 1294 to 1279 BCE, in the first year of his rule. The text reads, Year 1 of Uhem Mesut, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Lord of the two lands, Menmar, give life. One came to say to his majesty, the vanquished Shasu, they plan rebellion. Their tribal chiefs are gathered together, rising against the Asiatics of Karhu. They have taken to cursing and quarreling, each of them slaying his neighbor, and they disregard the laws of the palace. Breasted, 2001, 3:51-52. Besides indicating that the Edomites gave the Egyptians continual problems, the text perhaps sheds some light on a subject already discussed, the nature of Edomite government in the Bronze Age. According to the above text, the Edomites were still a divided and tribal society in the late Bronze Age, which would also seem to give credence to the theory that the Edomites were divided at the time of the Exodus. After all, the Exodus is believed by most scholars to have taken place during the reign of Seti I and or his son Ramses II, ruled circa 1279 to 1213 BCE. In a text from his mortuary temple at Abu Simbel, Ramesses II described how he resettled the Shasu, or Edomites, and other conquered peoples in different parts of the empire. The practice was not heard of at the time, though it became much more widely used centuries later by the Assyrians. The text reads, "The good God, slaying the 9 bows, crushing the countries of the north, valiant in the countries, a mighty swordsman, like Montu, bringing the land of the Negroes to the land of the north, the Asiatics to the land of Nubia. He has settled the Tehenu on the heights, filling the stronghold which he built with the captivity of his mighty sword, slaying Karu, wasting Retenu, with his sword overthrew." Breasted, 2001, 3:198. After Ramesses II made peace with the Hittites early in his reign, the Levant was pacified once again and the Edomites were not heard from for a while. Ramesses II's long reign was characterized by extensive building activities. After making peace with the Hittites, the pharaoh was free to leave his name throughout Egypt at Karnak, Luxor, Abu Simbel, and a number of other temples. The king's interest eventually turned to the western border, where forts were constructed to deal with the Libyan threat. Kurt, 2010, 207. Meanwhile, the colonies in the Levant received much less attention, or at least they were not mentioned as a crisis in the texts. Shasu, or Edom, was all but forgotten for the rest of Ramesses' long reign, but the Edomites made their presence known to the Egyptians again, right before the collapse of the Bronze Age system, which unraveled around 1200 BCE during the reign of Ramesses II's son and successor, Merneptah. Merneptah had to contend with a major invasion by a combined force of sea peoples and Libyans, and though the Egyptians repulsed the attack, other kingdoms and cities in the Near East were not so lucky. Mycenaean Greece collapsed, partly due to its own actions, as did the Hittite Empire and the wealthy and influential Levantine city of Ugarit. Besides the sea peoples and the Libyans, other peoples were taking advantage of the general situation by ravaging cities and taking land. The Aramaeans emerged from the desert and pushed into the Levant around this time. Hull and Jotiski, 2009, 47. Causing chaos for the Edomites and signaling the beginning of the end of Egypt's control in the region. It appears that Merneptah tried to control the migrations to a certain extent by forcibly moving some of the peoples, including the Edomites. A papyrus letter from an Egyptian general to the king details this policy. Another matter for the satisfaction of my lord's heart, to wit, we have finished passing the tribes of the Shasu of Edom through the fortress of Merneptah and Hothmira. LPH, in Theku, to the pools of Pithom, of Merteptah Hotephramah, in Theku, in order to sustain them and the herds in the domain of the Pharaoh. Breasted 2001, 3, 198. As it turned out, Merneptah and the Egyptians were fighting a losing battle. The empire that Thutmose III had fought so hard to build was about to be wiped out. The 19th dynasty ended with an apparent succession crisis that carried over into the beginning of the 20th dynasty. Kurt, 2010, 209. The Libyans took advantage of the situation by staging more attacks, and large numbers of Libyan civilians began settling in Egypt at the same time, especially the Delta, without resistance from the Egyptian authorities. The Sea People's invasions were not over either, and in fact become more pronounced in some ways. The Hittite Empire had been toppled, so they no longer stood in the way of people advancing through Anatolia. Eventually, some of these bands of people began settling in the Levant, which is how the Philistine origins can be traced. But that only added more pressure to a region that had become a pressure cooker. The period of mass migrations and invasions continued for several more decades into Egypt's 20th dynasty. Ramesses III, ruled 1184 to 1152 BCE, is often viewed as the last great pharaoh of the New Kingdom. He left a fair number of monuments behind as memorials, but more importantly, he saved his kingdom from falling to the Sea People and the Libyans. That said, while most of Ramesses III's noble military maneuvers were more defensive in nature, such as stopping a Sea People's coalition in the Delta and checking the Libyans in the Western Desert, there is evidence that he attempted to hold some of Egypt's possessions in the Levant. For example, in the historical text known as Papyrus Harris, Ramesses III discussed a campaign against the Shasu and even mentioned Mount Seir. "I destroyed the people of Seir. Of the tribes of the Shasu, I plundered their tents of the people, their possessions, their cattle likewise, without number. They were pinioned and brought as captives, as tribute of Egypt. I gave them to the gods as slaves into their houses." Breasted 2002, 4, 201. Edom in the Iron Age. After Ramesses III, Egypt languished under a succession of inefficient rulers until the 20th dynasty came to an end, and with it the New Kingdom. Egypt was divided into fiefdoms by Libyan chieftains, and the political structure of the Levant was also reordered, with the Edomites playing a role. With the Egyptians and Hittites out of the picture, the peoples of the Levant were able to assert their independence and develop their own kingdoms. As such, when the Egyptian texts concerning Edom and the Edomites are compared with the biblical accounts and the archaeological evidence, it is apparent that the Edomite state, or proto-state, developed around 1000 BCE, about the same time as the neighboring kingdoms of Israel, Moab, and Ammon. Kurt, 2010, 416. The evidence also seems to suggest that Israel was the more advanced of the early Iron Age Levantine kingdoms. Israel produced a more complete written record, and, as will be discussed more below, it was also stronger militarily than its neighbors. The Bible is certainly biased in favor of the Israelites in these respects, but even secular historians acknowledge that Israel was the dominant kingdom in the region at that time. With that said, many believe that the early Edom influenced Israel's royal and possibly even religious ideology. Kurt, 2010, 437. This should not be surprising given that Edomites were in the region longer than the Hebrews or Israelites. But regardless, once Israel established its kingdom around 1020 BCE, it began an aggressive military campaign against its neighbors. In the Old Testament, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles all relate the history of the Kingdom of Israel in a fairly historical narrative. Israel is depicted as God's kingdom, but the tone of the books is for the most part a relatively unbiased historical account of Israel and its neighbors. According to 1 Samuel, Saul was the first king of Israel, which was quite small in comparison to other kingdoms in the vicinity. The Philistines controlled most of the coastline up to about the city of Dor, and north of that was Phoenicia. The Canaanite city-state of Megiddo and Tanch were independent, as were Ammon, Moab, and Edom. Hull and Jotiski, 2009, 51. Jerusalem was also still not under the Israelites' control, so Saul's seat of power was in Gibeah. Hull and Jotiski, 2009, 50. Saul quickly moved to change the border through an ambitious foreign policy of conquest, which required setting his sights on nearly all of his neighbors, including the Edomites. 1 Samuel states, "So Saul took the kingdom over Israel, and fought against all his enemies on every side, against Moab, and against the children of Ammon, and against Edom, and against the kings of Zobah, and against the Philistines. And whithersoever he turned himself, he vexed them." 1 Samuel 14:47. The constant war did not appear to win much land for the Israelites, and Saul was killed fighting the Philistines, according to 1 Samuel 31. Interestingly, while Saul was engaged in the protracted war against the Philistines, Edom and the Edomites are rarely mentioned. There may be a few different reasons for this, one being that perhaps they were still divided and quarreling. There is very little textual evidence that all of Edom was ever unified, so it would not be too difficult to believe that the more organized northern Edomites were attempting their own conquests as the Israelites were fighting the Philistines. Another possibility is that the Edomites were preparing for a Philistine victory. Based on geography alone, the Edomites probably would have wanted the Philistines to defeat Israel. Since Israel was between Philistia and Edom, effectively acting as a buffer state between the two kingdoms, there is no reason to believe that the Edomites would have desired an Israelite victory. A weaker Israel meant that Edom was safe within its own borders and quite possibly even presented the possibility that they could encroach on Israel's southern border. When David became king around 1000 BCE, he claimed Jerusalem as the capital, and according to 2 Samuel, he rapidly expanded south into Edom and east into Moab, incorporating them into the kingdom of Israel, which also King David did dedicate unto the Lord, with the silver and gold that he had dedicated all of the nations which he subdued, of Syria, and of Moab, and of the children of Ammon, and of the Philistines, and of the Amalek, and of the spoils of the Hadadezer, son of Rehob, king of Zobah. And David begat him a name when he returned from smiting of the Syrians in the valley of Salt, being 18,000 men. And he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all they of Edom became David's servants. And the Lord preserved David whithersoever he went. 2 Samuel 8:11-14. Although there are few texts from other peoples to corroborate the account, or much archaeological evidence for that matter, most historians believe that by the time of David's death around 960 BCE, Israel controlled most of the Levant. For Edom and the Edomites, this apparently meant that they were incorporated into the kingdom, but the details of their status remains unknown. Either way, the Edomites continued as a distinct culture and harbored both resentment towards the Israelites and a desire to be free from their rule. More problems. After David died, his son Solomon came to the throne and had a lengthy and, by all accounts, prosperous rule. The Bible discusses Solomon's wisdom and his many wives, but archaeological evidence from his era is quite scarce. Hull and Jotiski, 2009, 54. It is known that the Solomonic Temple in Jerusalem was built at that time and was there nearly 4 centuries, and later legends also attribute the lost mines of Solomon to the king, but those have yet to be positively identified. There is little doubt that Solomon brought stability to the kingdom, so when he died around 928 BCE, the kingdom was thrust into disarray and was split into 2 halves, Israel and Judah. Campbell Jr., 2001, 26. Although Israel was the larger and the more powerful of the 2 kingdoms, it suffered more political turmoil after the division and was often subject to more geopolitical intrigues. Kurt, 2010, 466. More importantly for Edom, the Edomites apparently saw it as a chance for them to win back their freedom, and they successfully revolted when Solomon died. Kurt, 2010, 456. The smaller and militarily weaker kingdom of Judah could not retain Edom as one of its territories, but the Edomites' freedom would prove to be short-lived because the geopolitical situation in the region shifted yet again. The Assyrian Empire was growing in power to the northeast, and to the southwest the situation had temporarily stabilized. Although Egypt was still divided among Libyan chieftains during and after Solomon's rule, these new powers rarely fought each other. A Libyan-descended dynasty known as the 22nd Dynasty came to power in the delta city of Tanis, and it was able to exert considerable influence over a good portion of Egypt. The first king of the 22nd Dynasty, Shoshenq I, ruled 945 to 924 BCE, built some monuments in Egypt, and also conducted a major military campaign into the Levant that directly affected Judah, Israel, and Edom. The campaign didn't last long, but it did have lasting effects on the region, and it greatly impacted Edom's political status. Shoshenq I's military campaign, which seems to have been more punitive than anything else, is discussed in 1 Kings 14, 25, and 26, and 2 Chronicles 12, 2-9 of the Old Testament. According to the books, it took place where Rehoboam reigned circa 928 to 915 BCE, was the king of Judah. 2 Chronicles states, "And it came to pass that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, because they had transgressed against the Lord, with 1,200 chariots and 70,000 horsemen, and the people were without number that came with him out of Egypt. The Lubims, the Sukkims, and the Ethiopians. And he took the fenced cities which pertained to Judah, and came to Jerusalem. So Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem, and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king's house. He took all. He carried away also the shields of gold which Solomon had made." 2 Chronicles 12, 2-9. The name Shishak corresponds to the Egyptian Shoshenq, but there were 6 kings who took that name. Determining which of those 6 kings is not so difficult, though, when comparing the dates of the Egyptian kings' reigns with that of Rehoboam, and also with an inscription dated to Shoshenq's rule. A topographical list on the walls of the Karnak temple from Shoshenq I's rule has the names of 155 peoples and locales surrounded by ovals. Kitchen 2003, 496. The text is somewhat formulaic as far as ancient Egyptian royal texts are concerned, with the king stating his name, what he had done, and giving thanks to the gods. Shoshenq I, king, great in fame, smiting the countries that assail him, achieving with his sword, that the 2 lands may know that he has smitten the chiefs of all countries. Utterance of Amun-Re. My heart is very glad when I see thy victories. I made the boundaries as far as thou desirest. I made the southerners come in obeisance to thee, and the northerners to the greatness of thy fame. Thou hast made a great slaughter among them without number, falling their valley, being multitudes annihilated and perishing. Afterward, like those who have never been born. Breasted, 2001, 356-357. The list then gives the name of the cities Shoshenq I conquered within Judah and Israel, but Edom is listed alone as the 56th entrant. Breasted, 2001, 350. Shoshenq I's campaign left Judah, Israel, and Edom in somewhat of a precarious position. Although the Egyptian king did not post troops to occupy the region, likely because he did not have the resources to do so, the attacks and sacking of the cities no doubt left a great deal of instability. With the stature of Israel already severely diminished after Solomon's death due to the division into 2 kingdoms, Shoshenq I's campaign probably resulted in Edom breaking free permanently from Judah. Campbell Jr., 2001, 214. The political situation was only temporary, as was the case so often in the ancient Near East. After Shoshenq I, the Egyptian threat to the Levant receded, and the Egyptians would not play a major role in the region for another 200 years. But in the meantime, the Assyrian Empire was growing with brutal efficiency, engulfing smaller city-states and kingdoms in the northern Levant, and expanding into Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The Assyrians had begun slowly building their empire in the late Bronze Age by destroying the kingdom of Mitanni and then taking territory from the Hittites. The overall collapse of the Bronze Age system and the mass migration of peoples that accompanied it did not adversely affect the Assyrians as it did most other peoples in the Near East. By 934 BCE, the period of Assyrian dominance, known as the Neo-Assyrian Empire, began with raids into northern Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Levant. Kurt, 2010, 473-479. Ironically, a strong kingdom of Israel served as a deterrent to Assyrian expansion in the southern Levant, and since the Assyrians, or any other invading force from the north, would have to first go through Israel before reaching Edom, the Edomites were temporarily protected from the Assyrians by being under the yoke of the Israelites. So although the Edomites were under the yoke of Israel, they were at least temporarily protected from the Assyrians. However, once the kingdom of Israel was divided and Edom went its separate way, the door was open to full-scale war in the Levant. The evidence indicates that the Edomites tried to play both sides for some time, cooperating with the Israelites and other Levantine city-states, but ultimately giving in to Assyrian pressure. The Edomites were regularly mentioned in the Assyrian annals beginning with the reign of Adad-nirari III. 810 to 783 BCE. It was during his rule that the Assyrians began moving west, attempting to take land in the Levant. One annal reads, "Palace of Adad Nirari, the great king, the mighty king, king of the universe, king of Assyria, under the protection of Assur, his lord, and brought the princes of 4 regions of the world in submission to his feet, who conquered from Mount Seluna of the east, rising sun, the land of Saban, Alipi, Harar, Arazash, Mesu, Madai, Gizilbunda and its totality, Muna, Parsua, Alabria, Abadana, Nairi to its farthest border, Andiu, which lies afar off, the mountain slope to its farther border up to the great sea of the rising sun, from above the Euphrates, Haiti, Amuri, in its totality, Tyre, Sidon, Humri, Umriland, Israel, Edom, Pelatsu, up to the great sea of the setting sun. I brought these lands in submission to my feet. Tribute and tax I impose upon them." Luckenbill 1, 262 to 263. The lands are arranged in topographical groups, with Edom and other Levantine kingdoms being mentioned in the last group. But the fact that Adad Nirari III mentioned campaigning against Edom does not mean that he conquered it. He could have received tribute from the Edomites without actually conquering or occupying the lands. The brutal reputation of the Assyrians preceded them, so it is just as likely that he sent representatives to Edom with an offer of tribute and formal submission peacefully. Conversely, he may have offered an ultimatum after destroying much of the kingdom and deporting the population. Once the Assyrian Empire began expanding southwest, there was no stopping it until it collapsed. Israel and Damascus formed an alliance and anti-Assyrian coalition in 734 BCE, but there is no evidence that Edom joined in the anti-Assyrian alliance. Coogan, 2001, 242. In fact, in texts dating to the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III, the Edomites are listed as bringing tribute to Assyria. The annals state, Iuazi, Jehoaz of Judah, Kaush Maluku of Edom, Musuri, Hanunu, Hano of Gaza, gold, silver, lead, iron, tin, brightly colored woolen garments, linens, the purple garments of their lands, all kinds of costly things, the products of the sea and the dry land, the commodities of their land, the royal treasure, horses, mules, broken to the yoke, I received. Luckenbill, 1989, 1, 287 to 288. The text is important in terms of Edom's history for a number of reasons. First, Edom is grouped with the other Levantine kingdoms and is considered a wealthy locale as one of the dry lands. Second, the mention of Kaush Maluku is one of the earliest known non-biblical mentions of an Edomite king. Finally, Edom is considered a submissive kingdom. It should be pointed out that Israel, not Judah, was the recalcitrant of the 2 Hebrew kingdoms at this time, and that Judah, along with Edom, submitted to Assyrian authority. Other Assyrian texts from the period list Edom as just on the edge of the empire. An Akkadian cuneiform text known as the Sargon Geography, which has been dated either to the reign of Sargon II, 721 to 705 BCE, or Sennacherib, 704 to 681 BCE, or both, lists Edom as on the far southwestern border of the Assyrian Empire. Horowitz, 1993, 152 to 153. That said, ancient Near Eastern topographical lists were not always consistent with political realities on the ground. For instance, The Egyptian text discussed earlier frequently listed the Shasu Edomites as firmly under the control of the Egyptians, but the nature of the rule was much more fluid. It should be remembered that during the Egyptian New Kingdom, there were periods where their rule over Edom was probably nominal at best, such as during the late 18th dynasty and 19th dynasty. Shoshenq I's topographical lists from Karnak also demonstrated that kings would occasionally list cities and kingdoms among their conquests, despite the fact those places were not necessarily under their control after the conclusion of the military campaign. The same situation was at work with the Assyrian topographical lists. Over time, the Assyrian mentions of Edom and the Edomites became more frequent, albeit without most of the violence that accompanied their military campaigns. The texts do not provide many details about ancient Edom, but they do give the names of a few Edomite kings. The historical annals from Sennacherib's reign mention that he engaged in a major campaign to subdue Syria and the Levant in his 3rd year of rule. The text states, "In my 3rd campaign I went against the Hittite land, Syria, Tubalu, Ethbal. I seated on the royal throne over them, and tribute, gifts for my majesty, I impose upon him for all time, without ceasing." From Minhimu, Menahem, the Shamsimuranite, Tubalu, the Sidonite, Abdeliti, the Arvadite, Urumilki, the Bubalite, Mitini, the Ashadite, Budu Elu, the Beth Ammonite, Camosunadi, the Moabite, Malik Ramu, the Edomite, king of Amuru. All of them lavish gifts as their heavy tribute they brought before me for the 4th time and kissed my feet. Luckenbill 2, 119. Although the Akkadian name of the Edomite king, Malik Ramu, was probably pronounced differently in the Edomite language, he was a different king than the one mentioned in the text dating back to Tiglath-Pileser III. Of course, the time span between Tiglath-Pileser III and Sennacherib would certainly suggest that there would be more than one accompanying Edomite king, but the Assyrians could have used a stock name for all Edomite kings. Since they did not use a stock name in the text, it seems the Assyrians, quite familiar with the Edomite dynasty, and also that the Edomite state had advanced to a level that was on par with its neighbors. By Sennacherib's rule, there is no doubt that Edom was fully under the control of Assyria, as the Assyrians were beginning to eye Egypt. The Assyrian invasions of Egypt began in 674 BCE under Esarhaddon, 680 to 669 BCE, Kurt, 2010, 634. He was only able to hold Egyptian territory temporarily, but to even accomplish that, the Assyrians had to maintain tight control over the Levant, including Edom. In a cuneiform prism from Nineveh, Esarhaddon mentioned the lands he controlled and those he was about to subdue, and Edom is listed with the name of a new king. "And I summoned the kings of the Hittite land, Syria, and those across the sea, Palu, king of Tyre, Manasseh, king of Judah, Kashgubari, king of Edom, Musuri, king of Moab, Sili-Bel, king of Gaza, Matini, king of Ashalkan, a grand total of 22 kings of the Hittite land, Syria, the sea coast and the islands in the midst of the sea. All of them I gave them their orders and great beams." Luckenbill, 1989, 265-66. Israel was not mentioned because it no longer existed, having fallen under a prolonged siege that probably began during the short reign of Shalmaneser V, ruled 726 to 722 BCE, and ended under Sargon II in 722 BCE. Kitchen, 2003, 40. The Assyrians had destroyed the northern monarchy and deported a good share of the population, not only as a punishment to the Israelites, but also as a lesson to their neighbors, such as the Edomites. In this manner, they sought to deter occupied populations from rebelling. Under the reign of Ashurbanipal, 668 to 627 BCE, the Assyrian Empire reached its apex, although it was also not far away from collapsing. According to the sources, Kashugabari was still king of Edom, and was still reasonably in the good graces of his Assyrian overlords. A cuneiform cylinder describes how Ashurbanipal led a campaign into Egypt against the Nubians, and then received tribute from Kashugabari and other kings in the Levant. In the course of my campaign, Aalu, king of Tyre, Mintz, Manasseh, king of Lodi, Judah, Kashugabari, king of Edom, in all 22 kings of the seacoast, of the midst of the sea and of the dry land, vassals of mine brought their rich gifts before me and kissed my feet. Luckenbill, 1989, 2, 340 to 342. Little else is known about Kashugabari, but a few things can be guessed based on these limited mentions and the historical context in which they were written. Kashugabari knew that there was little he and the Edomites could do alone against the Assyrians, and he also knew that forming an anti-Assyrian alliance would very probably end much the same way it did for Israel. The Edomites likely rationalized that Assyrian rule was no worse than being ruled by any other nation if they cooperated. After all, the Assyrians only demanded a tribute and never interfered with local customs or even government, as evidenced by the fact that the Assyrian texts refer to Kashugabari and others as kings. The end of the Edomites. As they had in the past, the Edomites likely decided to play the long game and wait for the Assyrian Empire to decline. Indeed, the Assyrian Empire finally did collapse in 612 BCE, but this geographic area, with the exception of Egypt, was replaced by a new dynasty and empire. The new rulers were an ethnic group known as the Chaldeans, and their seat of power was in the ancient city of Babylon. So they are known today as the Neo-Babylonian dynasty, and their empire is referred to as the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The new dynasty would employ many of the same royal styles and ideology as the Assyrians, while also bringing back elements of older Babylonian dynasties. The Neo-Babylonians also rebuilt much of Babylon, which required an incredibly large amount of human labor and other resources from around the empire. Hull and Jatisky, 2009, 70-71. Neo-Babylonian rule meant that the Edomites would continue to have to pay tribute to a foreign ruler, but it was a ruler that operated much like the Assyrians, so the burdens were not that excessive. This time, however, while the Edomites went along with the Neo-Babylonian Empire, Judah was making moves to assert its independence by aligning with the revived Egyptian state. The move would prove to be disastrous for Judah, but quite fortunate for the Edomites. After the Neo-Babylonians defeated the Egyptians and Judeans on the battlefield in 587 BCE, the Egyptians returned home, leaving Jerusalem to face a long siege. The siege finally ended in 586 BCE with the Neo-Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, 604 to 562 BCE, taking Judah's royal family and a large share of its population into captivity in Babylon. Coogan, 2001, 266. According to the Old Testament minor prophet Obadiah, the Edomites quickly took advantage of the situation by helping the Hebrews' mortal enemies. And thy mighty men, O Teman, shall be dismayed, to the end that every one of the mount of Esau may be cut off by slaughter. For thy violence against thy brother Jacob shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. In the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem. Even thou wast as one of them, but thou shouldst not have looked on the day of thy brother in the day that he became a stranger. Neither shouldst thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Thou shouldst not have entered into the gates of the people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldst not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. Neither shouldst thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Neither shouldst thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. Obadiah 1, 9-14. Despite the Bible's numerous statements that the Israelites saw the Edomites as their brothers, the Edomites apparently did not see things the same way. After helping the Babylonians reduce Judah, the Edomites were apparently then allowed to occupy their land. The Old Testament book of Lamentations mentions that the Edomites quickly filled the void of the Hebrews who were taken from Judah into captivity. Although few details are related, it is clear that the Edomites did occupy the land. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, that dwellest in the land of Uz. The cup also shall pass through unto thee. Thou shalt be drunken, and shalt make thyself naked. The punishment of thine iniquity is accomplished, O daughter of Edom. He will discover thy sins. Lamentations 4:21 and 22. The process through which this happened is not entirely clear, but historians can make an educated guess by examining the historical context. The fact that the Edomites assisted the Neo-Babylonians in the siege and sacking of Jerusalem suggests that they were given some sort of favored status by Nebuchadnezzar II, or possibly even before he came to power. This would certainly follow the pattern that Cush-Gabari and the other Edomite kings established by working with the Assyrians, and the Neo-Babylonians were just the latest major empire to control the region. Once again, the Edomites likely figured cooperating with the major power was wiser than opposing it. Some modern scholars believe that the Edomite settlement of Judah began gradually in the years before 587 BCE, Azizi 2006-5, perhaps as a reward for their cooperation and as a punishment to Judah for joining the Egyptians. The Assyrian policy of allowing regional kings to keep their titles and provide them with nominal freedom as long as they paid their tribute was followed by the Neo-Babylonians. Kurt, 2010, 607. The Neo-Babylonian kings also required loyalty oaths from their conquered territories as their predecessors did. Kurt, 2010, 605. So it could be that the Edomite king was merely fulfilling his loyalty oath to Nebuchadnezzar II by assisting in the campaign against Jerusalem. The name of the Edomite king in 586 BCE is not known, but he is mentioned by the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah. In the passage, the Edomite king is mentioned as being in a potential alliance with Judah, but ultimately loyal to Nebuchadnezzar II. Thus saith the Lord to me, Make thee bonds and yokes, and put them upon thy neck, and send them to the king of Edom, and to the king of Moab, and the king of the Ammonites. And it shall come to pass that the nation and kingdom which will not serve the same Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon, and that will not put their neck under the yoke of the king of Babylon, that nation will I punish, saith the Lord, with the sword, and with the famine, and with the pestilence, until I have consumed them by his hand. Jeremiah 27, 3-8. The theological implications of the passage are not important in terms of the history of Edom, but the fact that the king was mentioned is, since it seems to verify that the Neo-Babylonians allowed the Edomites to continue their nominal independence and rewarded the Edomites with a chunk of Judah. But this situation also raises questions about the ancient relationship between Edom and Israel, and it has led to speculation over whether the Edomites' actions were driven by a long-held hatred for their northern neighbor. The Old Testament verses cited above certainly imply that the Hebrew chroniclers believed that the Edomites harbored an ancient hatred for Israel that was driven by spiritual and religious concerns. And while the events do indicate that the Edomites probably did resent the Israelites, it was likely not based on religion. As mentioned earlier, little is known about the Edomites' religion other than it was probably similar to what other Canaanites practiced, and when it came to religious hostility in the region, it was almost always the Israelites who showed disdain for their neighbors' religions, whether Canaanite, Philistine, or later Phoenician, often because Israelites began worshiping Baal or one of the other regional gods. It would stand to reason that the Edomites, like the other people of the region, had no real religious animosity towards the Israelites, but like the Philistines, they coveted their land. Besides just having more land to control, once the Babylonians gave the Edomites Judah to settle for their loyalty, the Edomites gained control over the Wadi Arabah, which was rich in copper and iron mines. Blueck, 1947, 81. In the decades after the sacking of Jerusalem, the Edomites mixed with the remnants of Judah. The Edomite culture continued for a while, but eventually new invaders once again changed the geopolitical and cultural landscape of the region. Not long after the Edomites began moving into Judah, a nomadic ethnic group from Arabia known as the Nabateans first occupied Edom and then slowly moved into Judah. The Edomites mixed with the Nabateans, and the new Nabatene culture began to dominate the region. McCarter, 1976, 89. The remnants of the Edomites moved farther north and west, eventually claiming the region that became known as Idumea. What was southern Judah also assumed a new identity that was influenced by the Edomites, Jews, and Nabateans. This new region became known as Idumea, which was a Greek derivation of Edom. Aziz, 2006, 4. During the Seleucid Empire, but the Late Bronze Age and Early Iron Age, Edomite culture was drastically changed by the late 6th century BCE. The Edomites continued to exercise an influence on the region, though, as the Idumeans later became the progenitors of the Herodian dynasty. Blueck, 1947, 79. But before the Herodian dynasty came to power, another dynasty ruled the region. The Hasmonean dynasty ruled over the region starting in the late 2nd century BCE, including over Idumea. This dynasty arose after the Jews successfully revolted against the Seleucids and brought the region under Jewish control for the first time in several centuries. Hull and Jotiski, 2009, 33. The Seleucids were forced to give the Hasmonean Jewish kingdom autonomy and were also powerless as the Hasmoneans conquered Idumea and converted much of the population to Judaism. 5 Hasmonean kings ruled until 37 BCE. Greenspoon, 2001, 337. The 1st century CE Jewish Roman historian Josephus is one of the best ancient authorities concerning the Edomites, Idumeans, and the role they played during the Seleucid dynasty and later early Roman rule. He noted how the Hasmonean king John Hyrcanus ruled 134 to 104 BCE, conquered the Idumeans, while the Seleucids' king Antiochus VII, ruled 138 to 129 BCE, was campaigning in the east. Josephus wrote the following: When later Antiochus marched against the Parthians, giving him a chance to retaliate, Hyrcanus at once launched a campaign at the towns of northern Palestine, correctly assuming that he would find no first-class troops in them. Medabi and Gibeah with the towns nearly submitted, as did Sechem and Gerizim. He was successful also against the Cathians, the people living around the copy of the temple at Jerusalem. In Idumea, a number of towns submitted, including Adorah and Marissa. Advancing to Samaria, where now stands Sebest, the city built by King Herod, he constructed a wall right round and entrusted the siege to his sons, Aristobulus and Antigonus. They pressed it relentlessly, bringing the inhabitants so near to starvation that they resorted to the most unwanted food. Josephus, the Jewish War, 1:72. After they were conquered by the Hasmoneans, the Idumeans did what they had done before when they were ruled by Israel, the Assyrians, and then the Neo-Babylonians. The Idumeans or Edomites not only cooperated with the Hasmoneans by accepting Judaism, but they also worked with the Romans, who were the new power in the region. An Edomite elite named Antipater the Idumean began playing a major role under the rule of John Hyrcanus II, ruled 76 to 40 BCE. It was a period when there was much instability in the region as Rome was about to enter its first phase of civil war that brought down the Republic, so there were plenty of people trying to take advantage. The brother of John Hyrcanus II, Aristobulus, led a large rebellion which resulted in Pompey the Great sending Mark Antony to put it down. Pompey eventually captured Jerusalem himself in 63 BCE after a month siege, Hull and Jotiski, 2009-79. Pompey was Julius Caesar's main rival during the infighting in the mid-1st century BCE, and after he was assassinated in Egypt, Caesar was able to dismantle the Republic. In 47 BCE, Julius Caesar met with the elites of Judean society in order to come to an amicable and peaceful resolution as to its rule. According to Josephus, the meeting went well for Antipater the Idumean. Soon after this, Antigonus, son of Aristobulus, had an interview with Caesar which had the unexpected result of winning Antipater further advancement. But he went on to accuse Hyrcanus and Antipater, openly alleging that in a most iniquitous fashion they had driven him and his sisters right out of their native land, that, in their insolence, they had treated the whole nation outrageously, that they had sent assistance to Caesar in Egypt, not out of loyalty to him, but through fear springing from old differences and in the hope that their friendship with Pompey would be forgotten. Antipater retorted by throwing off his garments and exposing his countless scars. Having listened to both, Caesar declared Hyrcanus the better candidate for the high priesthood and allowed Antipater to choose his own office. Antipater left it to the bestower of the honor to decide its magnitude and was appointed commissioner for all Judea with authority to rebuild the demolished walls of the mother city. These honors Caesar ordered to be engraved in the Capitol to commemorate his own justice and Antipater's splendid services. Josephus, The Jewish War, 1:201. Thanks to Caesar's choice, the Edomites ironically found themselves in control of Judea after several centuries of being an occupied people. Antipater installed his sons Faisal and Herod as governors. But he was poisoned and died not long after in 43 BCE. After the Parthians briefly held Judea from 40 to 37 BCE, Antony restored Roman rule over the region and installed Herod as king of Judea in 37 BCE. Hull and Jotiski, 2009-80. Herod is one of the more well-known characters of the Bible, as even those with a limited knowledge of the Bible will recognize the name and maybe have some idea of who Herod was. One of the most popular stories, known even to non-Christians, is Herod's slaying of the innocents, a gruesome part of the Christmas story. Others who may know a little bit more about the Bible will know of the accounts of Herod and John the Baptist, Herod and Jesus, Herod who was eaten by worms, and maybe even Herod and Paul. Although Herod doesn't appear in the Bible very often, it is at critical junctures in New Testament history that readers come across the name, and a casual reader of the Bible might incorrectly assume that each time the name Herod is mentioned, the Bible is referring to the same person. In fact, there were actually 6 different people in the New Testament who were part of this dynasty of Herods. From before the birth of Christ until the destruction of Jerusalem, the Herodian dynasty was a ruling family in the region. The family of Herod came from Idumea, so they were considered by some Jews to not be qualified to sit on the throne of David in Jerusalem. However, the close connections of the family with the current Roman emperors and those who were to become emperors kept them in power for almost 100 years. Many of the native Judeans were unhappy with the situation because Herod often ruled with an iron fist and his family was only recent converts to Judaism, having been descended from the Edomites. That fact was not lost on the Jewish population of the region, but the kings of the Herodian dynasty ruled as Jews, observing the Sabbath and other aspects of Jewish religion. The Herodian dynasty was in some ways the high point of Edomite culture, but it also proved to be the end of it. Herod the Great's reign over Judea lasted from 37 to 4 BCE. The first 10 years witnessed a concentrated effort to consolidate his powers, strengthening his control over this unsettling portion of the Roman Empire. Herod faced opposition from the remaining Hasmonean family members, the Jewish people and the Pharisees, the ruling class of Judea and Cleopatra of Egypt. The people who were under the persuasion of the Pharisees were the most present threat to Herod. The Pharisees did not think that Herod was a rightful ruler, since he was Idumean and not a full-blooded Jew. The fact that Herod was a friend of the oppressing Romans did not help his standing before the people either. Herod's tactics in dealing with the people was to punish those who were against him, while rewarding those who were on his side. The ruling class sided with Antigonus, also claiming that Herod was not a rightful ruler. Herod's solution to this threat was to execute 45 of the most wealthy and prominent of the aristocracy. Their properties were confiscated, and Herod's coffers were replenished as a result of their deaths. The Hasmoneans, the previous dynasty in Judea, also maintained that Herod was not a rightful ruler. Although Herod had married into the family, it was his mother-in-law, Alexandra, who was most resistant to Herod. Since Hyrcanus had been mutilated and therefore no longer qualified to serve as a high priest, Herod needed to appoint a replacement. Herod installed Ananel, an insignificant priest of the Zadokite family, considered to be descendants of Moses' brother, Aaron. Alexandra took this as an insult to the Hasmonean dynasty and insisted that her son, Aristobulus, should have the position. Alexandra solicited help from Cleopatra of Egypt, who put pressure on Herod through Antony. Mariamne, Herod's wife, also put pressure on her husband to have her brother installed as a high priest. Herod succumbed to the pressure and unlawfully removed Ananel and made Aristobulus high priest at 17 years of age. Herod and Alexandra never trusted each other again. Alexandra attempted to escape from Jerusalem to Egypt with her son in 2 coffins. Herod uncovered the plot, causing him to keep a closer eye on his mother-in-law. Aristobulus was gaining popularity, so Herod felt compelled to eliminate this Hasmonean threat to his throne. At Jericho, Herod was Alexandra's guest and invited Aristobulus to go swimming to cool off from the Judean heat. Some of his swimming companions had been bribed by Herod, and they drowned Aristobulus. Herod mourned greatly and held a magnificent funeral, But Alexandra devoted her life to avenging the mysterious death. Again, she called on Cleopatra to engage Antony in putting pressure on Herod. Herod was called to answer for his charges. Antony had the power to sentence Herod to death, so Herod put his wife under careful watch. His instructions were to assassinate her if he were killed, because he did not want her to become another man's lover. Mariamne's guard, Joseph, his uncle, was accused by his wife of infidelity with the king's wife. Herod believed his wife at first, but then had Joseph killed without an opportunity to defend himself. Alexandra was also put in chains and placed under guard for her role. In addition to her role with Alexandra, Cleopatra was also a threat to Herod. Cleopatra was gaining more control of the region, and Herod was eventually forced to turn over some of the most fertile areas of his territory to her. When Antony was defeated by Octavian in the Battle of Actium, Herod had to prove his right to the Judean throne to Octavian. Before leaving to meet Octavian, he had his wife and mother-in-law placed under the custody of his steward and a trusted friend. Again, the instructions were to kill these two women if anything were to happen to Herod. He did not want them to take over the kingdom, but wanted it to be left in the hands of his sons. Octavian confirmed Herod in his royal position. When Cleopatra and Antony committed suicide, Octavian returned the land seized by Cleopatra and expanded the territory over which Herod ruled. But Herod's problems on the home front were not any better than his political problems. His wife and mother-in-law learned of the secret plan to execute them and keep the kingdom out of their hands, so they took the opportunity to spread rumors about the despised wife to turn Herod against her. Salome bribed Herod's butler to say that Mariamne had prepared a love potion for the king. The butler refused to give any details to Herod, and Mariamne's eunuch was tortured until he confessed of Mariamne's knowledge of the secret order to have her killed. Assuming this meant that Mariamne and Herod's trusted friend had been unfaithful, Somus, the friend, was executed immediately. Mariamne was tried and also executed. As Herod's health began to fail, Alexandra began to secure her position on the throne, should Herod die. Herod learned of this threat and also had her executed. The last of the Hasmonean males was executed by Herod in 25 BCE. Herod had executed his sister Salome's first husband and given her to Costobarus, an Idumean of the Hasmonean dynasty. Costobarus plotted with Cleopatra against Herod, but was forgiven by the king at the pleas of his sister. However, as Salome tired of her husband, she devised a plan to turn Herod against him. She revealed a plot against the throne and the hiding place of the rebels. Salome was free of her husband, and Herod was free of the Hasmonean threat to his throne. After securing his throne, Herod enjoyed several years of peace and prosperity, 25 to 14 BCE. This period is marked by massive building projects which Herod undertook, reshaping the Judean landscape and the Jerusalem skyline. Some of his buildings endeared him to the Jewish people, while others caused friction in the kingdom. The first building project attributed to Herod was the introduction of the quinquennial, repeated every 5 years, games to honor Caesar. The Caesars were considered to be deities, so to the Jews this went against the laws of Moses. Other athletic and civic venues were built throughout the kingdom, providing entertainment and culture to the region, although not particularly appropriate to the Jewish laws and customs. A royal palace was built as well as fortified cities, including Caesarea. His greatest architectural achievement was the rebuilding of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. Contemporary commentary indicates that it was the greatest, most attractive building in the region. Others suggested that it was Herod's effort to atone for his killing many of the Jewish sages and leaders. Herod's power began to unravel beyond the royal palace as neighboring nations refused to pay tribute and taxes. Seleucus, an Arabian king who was hostile to Herod, went so far as to spread rumors about Herod in the presence of the emperor. Augustus responded that their friendship was over and the relationship was restored to its earlier status through delegations sent to Rome. Rumors and plots continued within the royal family as the sons wrangled over the throne. As Herod's patience was stretched, Alexander and Aristobulus were put in prison and the king registered a complaint against them before Augustus. When the relationship between Augustus and Herod was restored, the emperor granted Herod absolute power to do as he wished with his sons. The stipulations included that a trial be held outside of Herod's territory and that the charges against the sons be investigated by a Roman court. The court found the two brothers to be guilty and ordered them to be strangled. Some 300 who complained that the trial had been unjust and that the brothers should be set free were denounced as friends of the traitors and were also executed. Antipater seized the opportunity to secure the throne for himself and requested to be sent to Rome with the will of his father, declaring him to be the successor. However, a plot was revealed that included Antipater's intention of killing his father so that he could get to the throne more quickly. When Antipater returned to Jerusalem, he was imprisoned in the king's palace and was tried the next day. Antipater had nothing to answer in his defense, and he was kept in chains while a report could be sent to the emperor. After another plot was revealed, Herod drew up a final will naming his youngest son, Antipas, as the sole successor to the Judean throne. It is at this time in Herod's life that he becomes a character in the biblical account. Shortly before his death, the Magi from the east came to Jerusalem to worship the newborn king of the Jews, Matthew 2. Herod, who had been murdering, plotting, and conniving to hold on to his kingdom over 30 years, was duly distraught. Matthew records that the entire city of Jerusalem was troubled along with the king about this news, Matthew 2:3. At first this appears to be odd. The Jews were being oppressed by the Romans, in particular their regional king, Herod the Great, a tyrant with little regard for his own people. Wouldn't the local populace be rejoicing in the birth of a true king of the Jews? Perhaps someone who would liberate them from the crushing reign of Herod was finally on his way. Perhaps the promised Messiah from Isaiah and the prophets would set them free from the strong arm of the faraway Roman emperor. But they were troubled. Considering the well-known history of Herod and his strong-arm rule over Judea and the squashing of any possible threat to his throne, the reason for their troubled spirits becomes clear. If there truly was a Jew who claimed to be the rightful king of Israel, what would this hot-headed Herod do? Would there be a manhunt? Would homes and villages be destroyed in his search of this pretender for the throne? Would there be even more bloodshed? What would happen to those who sympathized with this claimant to the throne? The citizens of Jerusalem were troubled. It was not for fear of a new king, but out of concern for what the current king would do to keep his throne. The priests and scribes were summoned to tell Herod where this king was to be born. Matthew's record seems to indicate that Herod's encounter with the Magi was not known to the religious leaders. Herod knew enough of the Old Testament prophecies that he was able to cunningly cloak his questions as a mere question about the prophetic writings. He said nothing of a king, but asked where the Christ, the Messiah, was to be born. Whether or not they had to research to find the answer, they reported that the prophet Micah had prophesied that the ruler would come from Bethlehem of Judah, Micah 5:2. Herod summoned the Magi to determine when the star had appeared, Matthew 2:7. He wanted more details without revealing his own plans. Herod wanted to be able to calculate the earliest possible time that this pretender to the throne could have been born. In his mind, a plot was developing to eradicate anyone born in Bethlehem from the time of the appearance of the star until the arrival of the Magi in Jerusalem. Apparently, based on Herod's later actions, the Magi stated that it had been 2 years since the appearance of the celestial phenomenon. Matthew 2:16. He sent them to Bethlehem, deceiving them to tell him where the child was, under the pretense that he would also worship him. Matthew 2:8. Upon leaving, the star reappeared, causing the Magi to rejoice. This second appearance of the celestial phenomenon verified to the Magi that they were headed in the right direction. The Magi visited and worshipped the child in a house in Bethlehem, not at the manger. Matthew 2:11. Having presented costly gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they were warned in a dream not to return to Herod, but to travel to their home via an alternate route. Joseph, the earthly father of Jesus, was warned in a dream to flee to Egypt to escape Herod's wrath. Herod discovered that the Magi had deceived him and became furious. He ordered the execution of all male children in Bethlehem 2 years and younger, based on the timing that he had learned from the Magi. Matthew 2:16-18. Herod, now nearly 70, was failing rapidly, and his power was waning. During the last decade of his reign, he was haunted by the thoughts of a rival to the throne. His climb to power had occurred over the corpses of thousands of people, including those closest to him. The paranoia and his age were wearing on the king in his last days. Tormented by fears, history records that Herod often called out to his beloved wife, Mariamne, and her sons, whom he had murdered. Bouncing between suicidal thoughts and bloodthirsty delirium, Herod the Great was on the verge of insanity during his last years. 5 days before his death, Herod received a letter from the emperor granting him permission to execute his son, Antipater. Unfortunately, this was a ray of joy to the dying tyrant. Antipater, who had falsely accused and then murdered his half-brothers, Alexander and Aristobulus, was brought to justice. While Antipater was awaiting execution, the palace was abuzz with news of another suicide attempt by Herod. Antipater attempted to bribe the guard, who had been convinced by the conniving prince that the king was actually dead. Instead of release from prison, Antipater's execution was given priority in the executioner's schedule. Within 5 days, the tyrant had died. The kingdom for which he had struggled was gone from his hands. By some reckoning, Herod the Great's death took place within a month after the visit of the Magi to the palace. Salome and her husband, Costobarus, were too wise, or perhaps politically motivated, to follow the orders of the king to execute the nobility. Their liberation, combined with the death of the tyrant, led to a joyous time of feasting and fasting. Great pomp and empty pageantry characterized the funeral procession, leading to the castle of Herodium near Bethlehem. Herod reigned for over 30 years, most of which was filled with violence and bloodshed. The complicated family tree and the intrigue which developed around it may seem irrelevant, but it helps the Bible student understand the culture in which the Gospels were set. It is particularly interesting to note that Herod's murdering of the children in Bethlehem was not out of character for this king. He was constantly aware of threats to his reign and would stop at nothing to secure the throne for himself or his son. The massacre of innocent children in a small village outside of Jerusalem was nothing peculiar for this king. Beginning with the night of his father's death, Archelaus and his friends celebrated by rioting. Within a short time, Archelaus began promising amnesty and reforms, but the people of Judea would not be easily persuaded. The recent murders of the rabbis by his father brought about mourning and then rebellion. rather than listening to the appeals of the people to punish those who had murdered the rabbis, and having learned from his father how to rule, Archelaus silenced the rebellion by slaughtering about 3,000 Jews within the sacred precincts of the temple. Although Archelaus was celebrated by the people as the successor, Antipas claimed he had the legal right to the throne. Archelaus was accompanied by his mother, his aunt Salome, and other relatives, but it appears that the entire family, upon arrival in Rome, began appealing for Antipas' claim to the throne. While each member of the Herodian family appears to have their own agenda, grabbing for power and status at any cost, it seems that they would have rather seen Antipas on the throne than Archelaus. The two brothers headed to Rome and placed another brother, Philip, in charge of the realm temporarily. While Archelaus and Antipas were in Rome, a revolt broke out in Palestine. In typical Herodian response, Philip attempted to suppress the revolution by fire, sword, and crucifixions. The emperor was now faced with greater complications in Judea. Philip came to the capital to plead for more resources to quiet the rebellion and to argue his case in support of Archelaus. At the same time, a delegation of 50 Jews from Palestine, who were joined by 8,000 Roman Jews, approached the emperor, pleading for the dismissal of the Herodian family from Palestine because of their crimes. Emperor Augustus attempted to resolve the complicated issues with a compromise. Herod's territory would be divided up among the brothers. Archelaus was named ethnarch, with the promise to be named king if he proved himself to be a worthy ruler. Antipas was named tetrarch over the region of Galilee and Perea, north of Judea. Philip was placed as tetrarch over Galatnus, Trachonitis, Batanea, and Peneus, rather insignificant regions. Archelaus, while not maintaining control over the entire kingdom of his father, was able to claim two decisive victories through the emperor's decision. First, he maintained control of Jerusalem, the major political and religious city of Judea, and over half of his father's realm was under his rule. Second, he was able to keep his brother Antipas from his claim to the throne. The revolt, which began while the brothers were in Rome, lasted about 2 months and resulted in the porticos of the temple being burned. Roman soldiers also pillaged the temple treasury. The revolt spread beyond the city walls into the Judean countryside, even as far as Galilee and Perea. While the brothers' realms were decided by the emperor, their return began with the challenge of restoring peace among their subjects. Archelaus responded by treating the Jews and Samaritans brutally. It was during the reign of Archelaus that Joseph returned from Egypt with Mary and the small child Jesus. Rather than going to Judea to be subjected to the reign of terror instigated by Archelaus, Joseph took his young family to Galilee, Matthew 2:22. The reign of Archelaus only lasted for a couple of years. His horrific resentment of the people as well as his political maneuvering was not accepted by the people or by his brothers. He removed the high priest, Joazar, appointing his brother, Eleazar, who was replaced by Jesus, son of C. Archelaus would not be satisfied with partial loyalty of the high priest. Archelaus also divorced his wife Mariamne to marry the former wife of his half-brother Alexander. This was also against Jewish law, furthering his disdain among the people. Archelaus responded by greater oppression of those who dared to rebel against him. He was deposed in 6 CE, triggered by complaints to the emperor by Jews and Samaritans about his cruel treatment of the emperor's subjects. Jews and Samaritans despised one another so intensely that they rarely had any dealings with one another. To find both of these groups of people, who had been enemies for centuries, united in a common cause, further indicates the severity of the treatment of Archelaus toward his subjects. Additionally, his two brothers, Philip and Antipas, traveled to Rome to bring official charges against the ethnarch, to whom the others were subordinate. The cries of the people and the rulers reached the ears of the emperor, and Archelaus was sent to Vienna in Gaul, southeastern France, to live in exile. The other two brothers kept their realms, and the domain of Archelaus was divided up to be ruled by prefects or procurators. The Herodian dynasty was a benefactor of the oppression and also a supporter of the invaders. In order to maintain their position and their lifestyle, Herod and his descendants had to curry the favor of the Roman Caesars. On the other hand, to keep peace in the region, they had to maintain control of the Jewish population. To the Romans, they had to be Roman, and to the Jews, they had to be Jewish. They were expected by Rome to collect taxes and maintain order. At the same time, the Jews desired them to respect and enforce the laws of Moses. With the backing of the Roman emperors, it was often much easier to side with the occupiers. If the Jewish populace was becoming unsettled and revolution was in the air, the Herodian rulers had all the political clout to call in a legion of the fiercest soldiers. This naturally led to greater tension and hatred of the Herodians, who seemed more like traitors than fellow countrymen. As kings reigning under the power of Caesar, the Herods also controlled the temple treasuries and the appointments to the position of high priest. This resulted in an abuse of power and manipulation of the Mosaic law for the king to place whom he wanted in that powerful religious position. Knowing that some of the high priests were nothing more than puppets in the king's hand, rather than representatives of God before the people, certainly contributed to some of the unrest in Jerusalem and Judea. Keeping this in mind gives a clearer understanding of the appeals of the religious leaders to squelch the growth and popularity of Jesus Christ and his followers. While the Jewish leaders were bringing religious charges against this movement, they knew that if they hinted at the potential for a political overthrow, the Herodian rulers would listen carefully and act. It was in this historical setting that the events of the Gospels and Acts took place. The ruling family was not liked, and at times not even respected by its subjects. Tensions between the people and the invading Roman armies was high. The royal family was constantly fearful of losing their power and position. That rank had been gained through murder, intrigue, and scheming. Those methods would continue to be practiced to secure the positions. Therefore, it's easy to understand why any threats to the throne had to be eliminated. When the Magi came seeking the one who was born King of the Jews, Herod the Great's logical response was to kill the boys who might possibly lay claim to his throne. John the Baptist's increasing popularity and his speaking out against the immorality within the royal family cost him his head. Jesus claimed to be King of the Jews and had a great following, which the royal family never experienced. This made it easy for the king and his supporters to seek a way to end the life of the Messiah. Instead, the failures of the Herodian dynasty resulted in its demise, and that also spelled the end of the Edomites as a political and cultural influence in the region. In due time, the Jews and Romans would engage in ghastly conflicts in the region, bringing about yet another mass deportation of the region's inhabitants, and setting in motion the chain of events that continue to have implications nearly 2,000 years later. This has been The Edomites, the history and legacy of the Kingdom of Edom in the ancient Near East. Written by Charles River Editors. Narrated by Delane Daniels. Copyright 2019 by Charles River Editors. Production copyright by Charles River Editors.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.